So, ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our discussion tonight, we have to assess and address some specific questions that are very important to this country. And I want to start by welcoming Mr. Dhanraj Singh from the Guyana Budget and Policy Institute, Mr. Ramesh Persaud, who everybody, I think most of you would know. He is, among many things, he is also a financial analyst. And so tonight we have asked him to wear his financial analytical ability to join us here. Mr. Roel Johnson is very experienced in terms of his own out-of-the-box thinking, and we have asked Roel to join us here tonight to look at a couple of things. And to you, Dhanraj, I would like to start with you by throwing the following at you, sir. The question is Guyana bankrupt? And before I ask you to answer, let me highlight to everybody, the Finance Ministry has said it is unable to do anything about Gaisuku's imminent closure because of bankruptcy. Everywhere else we are hearing, in a lot of places we are hearing people are not getting their salaries. There are other agencies and institutes that are struggling. We know that the commercial banks are having a problem because when you look at the interest rate you're getting and the loan interest rate, that spread, we're looking at a number of things. But Dhanraj and Ramesh, to you gentlemen, I say, there is a headline in the Washington Post that goes like this: the once thriving Guyana slides into bankruptcy. Dhanraj, to you, sir. Proceed.
All right, good evening, everybody.
Sorry, Dhanraj, before we go ahead, just a correction, slight correction. That headline is from 1984.
I know. Hold on, buddy. Come on.
Go ahead.
All right. So thanks for having me, and to the other distinguished panelists. It's a pleasure to sit with you and to help to address this issue. You, as an economist, I take that the use of that term bankruptcy very serious, and I don't believe in the moment this is a term that we can throw around either sensibly or carelessly, but there are consequences and ramifications for using that term. I will stay away from the branding the economy as bankrupt per se, and I'd like to use some different expression.
Okay.
Things in economics are oftentimes not black and white, they're shades of gray. And so you either move to one end of the ladder as opposed to the other end. But that said, I would like to use the distinction between being dead and being a coma. And so where I would put Guyana is that we're not dead. The economy is not dead, but it certainly is in a coma. And the reason why I say that is, if much like when you go to the hospital and you go and check your vitals, there's economic statistics and measures that you would use to test the vitals of the economy. Certainly, this is the case that we're talking about, whether or not there is money there for the state to meet its obligation, both in terms of services and to meet its debt obligation. Now, I think it is no strange, it's not strange to anybody by now. You would have seen a lot of numbers throwing around social media. But here are some of the facts. When you look at, for example, the central government deposits account at central bank, that's one of the things you see floating around on social media. So let me address that first and foremost. You see right now that the balance, as of April of 2020, is a negative $92 billion. Now, that's a massive hole inside of the nation finance. I want people to not only think about this as just $92 billion in deficit, but I want to put some historical context and perspective in it. If you go back for the last decades, you will find that post-1992, not a single year has that particular account ever been in a deficit. Not a single year. And bear in mind, in 2005, we had a flood, a natural disaster that wiped about 60% of the value, equivalent of the value of the economy. And even at that time, the economy was with that particular account, had a balance of about $22 billion. In 2010, sort of the immediate period in the aftermath of the crisis, the global recession, that account had $70 billion inside of it. So I want people to understand that when we talk about the fact that the nation finance has a $90 billion hole, and that is just in one of the accounts that we're dealing with here, in terms of historical perspective, it is unprecedented. I mean, I even go back to accounts, this number since in the 1960s and 80s, and you will see back in the 1960s, you still have more money inside. So that's one one aspect of it quickly. The other point that I would like to point out is that when you look overall at our foreign reserves from 15 to 19, you had a significant decline of about $34 billion in foreign reserves. And that should tell you something immediately, that when the economy is not doing well and you're not gaining foreign assets, you have to then liquidate some of the assets that you have in order to meet your obligations. So I'm going to respond to more as you get into the discussion. But overall, I would want to say that I wouldn't use the term that the economy is bankrupt, because I think that has serious ramification in terms of the way investors perceive the economy. Right.
So thank you for that. Ramesh, I want to come to you with the following. So the reason I quoted this headline, and Ruel, here is the reason I quoted the headline. In 1984, the Washington Post said, once thriving Guyana slides into bankruptcy. And in 1985, Guyana had one of its most or more fraudulent elections ever. It is at a time when governments are always going through some throes of electoral and all of these kinds of things. So in 1984, 1985, there was this article from Washington Post. Now in 2020, 19 going to 20, you're looking at a situation where Guyana is facing a serious, as Dhanraj would say, it's almost comatose. It is a very serious and precarious financial position. Ramesh, what's your take?
All right, thank you very much, Joe. Thank you for having me again. The situation is one of concern. A few weeks ago, I chose not to use the term bankruptcy because economists don't like that, because we have to continuously do that. So I use the term that we don't have the kind of fiscal space to deal with what we have to deal with. So imagine the word fiscal is defining the government purse, but the government purse doesn't have as much as we would like to look at. In economics, I just look at the existing position, and you always have to look at things in cycle and so forth. Indeed, we have a situation whereby we don't have as much money in the local accounts, but I just want to share with you a perspective of what took place in terms of the total debt and the total national debt. And I like to go back from 2010 to 2014 and compare that period to 2015 to 2019 to help explain the situation with the amount of money that the local account gone into overdraft in. The foreign debt between 2010 to 2014 increased by $58 billion. 2015 to 2019, that foreign debt increased only by $28 billion. Good? Two different administration period. The local debt increased between 2010 to 2014 by $61 billion. The foreign debt increased by $61 billion, and the local debt increased by $102 billion. So that movement in the overdraft facility you're seeing there is an expansion of the debt in the local debt. So if one is to look between 2010 to 2014, the total debt stock of the country increased by $119 billion as compared to the debt stock increasing by $130 billion in the last 5 years. 119, 130 billion, a $10 billion difference between the two 5-year period. So whilst we are seeing the overdraft account being expanded in the Bank of Guyana and the current position is bad, what it is a reflection of is that the current government has chosen to borrow from the local economy through the deposits of commercial banks that would have been made to the central bank, rather than borrowing money from the international financial institutions. Good? So what the other administration might have been better at doing is subjecting themselves to the scrutiny and so forth to borrow from the foreign institutions. Good? So that is what.
So Ramesh, stick a pin, because you mentioned something very important there. One of the differences between going locally and overseas would be the scrutiny and of course access, right?
Correct. It is access and it is also scrutiny. To borrow from an international financial institution, you have to do a whole host of feasibility study. To run up your overdraft at Bank of Guyana doesn't require any study. It does require withdrawal.
Direction.
So in the two.
Yog, I want to jump in on that point, pick up one way around on something. I think there's another perspective of the decision whether to borrow from local and foreign. There's another factor that plays into this. At least certainly the way economists would look at this from an external position. And you think about it this way, the process to access funding in the international markets is rigorous. We know that. The process to access funding locally is not so rigorous. So whenever you see a government moving from the international market to more reliance on the domestic market, it begs questions about the foundation of the economy and the strength of the economy, and whether or not that decision was in part, not in totality, in part guided by the fact that had they gone to the international market, they may not have gotten the kinds of access to funds that they might have wanted to. And again, so I'm just saying, bear that in mind, that when you see the transfer from foreign to local, it not necessarily mean that everything is all well and peachy and it's just a random decision.
So Ramesh, I know I'm rushing and probably pushing something ahead that we might have wanted to bring on a little later, but here's my question. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, let's say, when we thought of oil revenues, we thought of oil revenues as from ground and up. In other words, you're ground zero and you're building up, up, up. Today, when we're thinking about oil revenues, we got to think about a $92 billion deficit. So you're actually gonna, are you at risk of using up your oil revenues to fill a hole?
You're at risk, but it depends on the policy. I mean, with the natural resources fund in place, it will prevent that from happening, because you have to set up certain accounts and certain arrangement and work with your fiscal rule before you utilize it. I mean, any government.
But hold on. Hold on.
But so, before you go there, the legislation is currently preventing that from happening.
But hold on. Let's put it in a layman's perspective. If there is $92 billion, if there is X amount, you said $102 billion of debt, I think you said?
I said that it increased by 102 billion.
So
move from the 15 billion to the 92 that you're talking about.
Okay. So if there is this amount of debt, every man, woman, and child in this country is indebted in layman's term. We all have to contribute towards paying back this debt one day. But at the same time, you would have the oil monies that would be in a reserve. From a layman's perspective, are we wrong to say net there is nothing, because you're banking up one side, but you're digging a hole and you got to pay interest on the other side? I know that for developmental and policy purposes is a different matter, but for the layman, Ramesh.
All debt has to be paid off, all right? So as we are getting revenues, setting off that means that we're still in a negative position based on the amount of revenues that we have. So you are right. There is an amount of debt that we have to pay off. Now, you have to also follow on how we get that debt, all right? And debt has been used to spend on, all right? Debts for the government is generated by budget deficits, good? For the last 10 years, we budget deficits, good? Meaning that we're spending more than we're actually receiving. Because we don't have the kind of revenue sources to give you that surplus. Now, for the first time in this year and continuing next year and the other, we will then start building up those surpluses depending on how we save the oil money. Just to give you a perspective, I mean, in the 2010 to 2014 period, the government of Guyana for that 5-year period collected from their citizens in taxes, central government that is, about $640 billion of revenue. Between 2015 to 2019, they collected $991 billion in total. The current administration extracted from its citizens almost $350 billion more than what the previous administration extracted from their citizens. But yet we are still in a deficit. That's because if one looks at the current expenditure in the previous just concluded year has gone up significantly as compared to the capital expenditure. So the previous government had a lower routine expenditure and a higher capital expenditure. The current government has a higher, in proportion we're talking about percentages term, has a higher routine expenditure and a lower capital expenditure. We all know from a financial perspective, one means that you're investing into the long term, and one you are dealing with in the current period. All right.
But it's a matter of government policy too, right? It's a matter of the policies.
Government policy. Yeah.
Correct.
But it will take us some time to overcome that debt threshold that we have.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yo, may I ask Ramesh a question?
Sure.
Who are we paying? Who are we borrowing from on the local level? When we apply to an IFI, World Bank.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you clearly because
when we apply for loan to the World Bank, IDB, IMF, etc. We know who we're borrowing from. When we borrow locally, with less strictures on accountability, etc., who precisely are we borrowing from?
Well, when we borrow locally, we are borrowing from the central bank. And who deposits at the central bank? It is the commercial banks that are depositing at the central bank. Good? The commercial banks deposit at the central bank. I think it's somewhere about $85 billion of deposits that commercial banks have with the central bank. And commercial banks would also buy treasury bills from the central bank. And that's how we are borrowing. So technically, the government, by running up $92 billion, has indirectly borrowed from the local commercial bank. And if for any reason, I mean, sovereign states are always able to pay back their debt some reason or the other. I mean, some of them can be deemed as junk at some point and have difficulty. But once it's a government that people find a way of doing that. So technically that money that Bank of Guyana would have had there to lend to the government would have come from the commercial bank deposits that the commercial banks would have had to deposit to the central bank.
Yeah.
And that would have come from the people who have deposited into the commercial bank.
Exactly.
Correct. All right, the depositors of the commercial bank. Now, what is important to understand is that the overdraft at the central bank for the government is more than the deposits of the commercial banks.
Yeah, so...
Which is a problem, right?
What impact, gentlemen, what impact did the Gaisuko bond, if any, would have had on this $92 billion that we've seen here? Do we know?
Well, I don't think the bond money you can mix the two of them. The 30 billion bond that the government guaranteed for Gaisuko, up until the last numbers that I've looked at, 17.6 billion of that was already accessed. Now, there was an article in the news that says of that 17 billion, basically 9 billion and something was spent. I don't know how true or how good those numbers are, but I certainly know that almost 60% of it was accessed already. You can't take that and put it into the saving. That was a bond tied to something specific.
So the normal man in the street, I just have a follow-up.
Before you go there, Guyana, about the bond, right? So the bond was raised $30 billion. Only $17.6 billion was drawn down on the bond. It was funded for 17.6 at that point, but the next tranche is supposed to come in afterwards. Now, the government of Guyana's role in this is that they give a sovereign guarantee. The government of Guyana guarantee that. And in financial terms, that's what we call a contingent liability, a liability that has not realized itself as yet, that it would only realize if Gaisuko failed to repay that money, then the government of Guyana will have to take that fully. In the total debt stock calculation, which I don't have available in front of me, I'm not sure if Dhanraj has a number, but both the foreign and the local debt stock that the Ministry of Finance will provide, I think they've accounted for the 17-point-something billion as a contingent liability and reported that as part of the total debt stock of the country.
Okay.
Where
included in our national debt.
Where did the money go? Where did where did the money go that would have pushed us to $92 billion? Do we have a breakdown for the normal layman in the street who don't understand all these terms and what it really meant? Where did the money go?
Well, that's a very loaded question, Leonard. The money, as I said, I'll keep it simple.
Yes.
Collecting less money than we are spending. So the money went into routine and capital expenditure of the government. All right. Exactly which projects, and so I will leave that for you to figure out. But it is funding the budget deficit that we have on an annual basis.
Ramesh, about $10 billion of that 90 was I think was between February and March of this year. How does government spend that amount of money, recurring expenditure, when we don't have a functional government in place, we don't have a budget passed.
Well, Dhanraj, you want to take that before I get?
I think there's two parts of the question that you're asking there. I'm gonna set the functional and the legality of the government part aside. But I think Ramesh had alluded to this to some extent before. If you think about the sort of expenses that the government has to meet for running the entire government, paying public service and workers and all of that, and meeting debt obligations that they have already, that they have to meet over the year, but then you have to break that down. Let's say you break that down at the end of the month. So on a month-to-month basis, people got to collect checks. Public servants have to collect checks. You have to pay people. And so you might imagine at the time, and again, I'm speculating here using reason, at a time when you don't have a lot of revenues that are coming in because of the lockdown and all the political situations that are happening, it may suggest that you need to tap into that facility to meet those obligations.
But $10 billion $10 billion in current expenditure without any significant capital outlay.
Well, let me explain that a bit more. Ruel. In 2019, I can use that as a base because I don't have numbers for 2020, right? The revenues the government collected in 2019, it's $240 billion. Their routine expenditure was $207 billion, and the capital expenditure, I believe, was about $66 billion or something like that. So government spends an average between capital expenditure and routine expenditure on a monthly basis between $20 to $25 billion per month. So your government expenditure, let's say routine expenditure is probably $20 billion per month. And non-routine expenditure, like capital expenditure, if you're spending $60 billion a year, is about $5 billion per month. So if you run up your overdraft by $10 billion, it means that your revenue for that month fell short by $10 billion. And we could understand why your revenue fell short. If businesses are closed, businesses are not operating and shut down, business revenue is down, business employment cost is down, PAY is down, corporation tax is down, and so forth. That is why when people say that the private sector don't matter and business don't matter, I don't think they understand what they're really talking about. Everybody needs to exist and coexist with each other. If businesses don't do well, governments can't have money to spend, excepting if they're borrowing money. Because your source of money is taxation. Good? So a government will want their businesses to do well because they are a significant stakeholder in those businesses. And what we have seen
a government should want.
A government should want businesses to do well, because a business taxes is like paying dividend, for example. Government gets its share, shareholders get their share. All right. One will argue about proportionality and so forth, but without taxes, the government will just have to borrow and borrow and borrow, or sell out their natural resources and depend on that.
Jog, let me add 2 quick points to what Ramesh just said. Roel, just to be clear, that what Ramesh offered you, myself, and him, there is an explanation of what could be the explanation of the 10 billion. We don't know for sure. It could be, and we're giving the most liberal interpretation of what might be the case. Unless we see the receipts and see what it was actually spent for, we would not know. The other point that I want to make is going back to the bigger question of how do we put in perspective the hole that we're seeing in the state finance. Generally, when governments lean heavy on debt, it is when there is some pressures on the revenue side. Generally. So you might think of times of crisis, times of hardship, times of economic slowdown, or there is such a massive opportunity that you want to capitalize on that you decided to tap into the debt. What we have seen here over the last 5 years is something very strange. As Ramesh mentioned, we have seen that the government simultaneously extracted an additional $200 billion over the last 5 years as compared to the previous 5 years. So revenues grew. They took in a lot more. At the same time, it has also depleted the savings and dig a hole of 92 billion. So when you think about this on a grand scale, the question that you have to ask, with such a massive stimulus in the economy, where is the return for it? Where is the return for it?
We have
hold on a minute, gentlemen. Let me just put this in perspective. So the government over the period, the incumbent over the period of the last 5 years would have raised almost $1 billion in terms of taxes. Yes?
Yes, on an average basis.
Yeah. Compared to their predecessor that would have raised almost 300 million less. Yet, according to what you were saying, Dhanraj, they have used up all this excess revenues that they gathered, as well as dig a hole that has now taken us to minus 92 billion. Can you correct that, say whether that's correct or not?
Yes, that is precisely what I'm saying. And not only the 92 billion, the account, like I said, was in about 20 something billion when it was handed over in surplus. Now it's in 92 billion in debt. And that is also excluding the fact that you had about $25 billion in gold reserves, which is basically depleted complete with just some change in the account today. So that's the picture that I don't want us to lose sight on. You took the economy over, you extracted more revenues from your population and your households, shifting an additional 200 billion as compared to your predecessor. But in addition to that, you depleted the savings and dug a hole. So again, this is what bothers me when I look at this, not just the fact that, okay, we have some debt, but where is the return? Because when you use debt finance, local or foreign, the fundamental principle here is that you're investing in services or assets that will generate return over a longer period of time. And I can't see where that was done.
So gentlemen, tell us a little bit what happened to our gold reserves then.
Well,
how much you want to go?
Of the numbers not being reflected in the foreign reserve means that gold reserve would have been sold on the international market for foreign currency to come back to the country. That's all I can tell you about that. The gold reserve dropping by $25 billion, $24 billion would have been sold. Just to expand a bit on the point that Dhanraj made there.
Yeah.
There is $102 billion or $102 billion of movement in the local account. There's a drop off of $25 billion from the gold that was available there. Public enterprises who also have monies, organizations like NIS and GAIARL and GAISUCU and so forth, started the period with 42 billion and is now with 32 billion. I mean, 90% of that is probably NIS's money. So $10 billion of that is drawn out. What you're seeing in the graph account of $92 billion also is the government does accounting. So all they do there is removing the receipts and the payments. What you have not seen is the debts that are still unpaid, all the projects that are being unpaid, contingent liabilities that are unpaid, any project that is left unpaid, and so forth might not have been fully capitalized in that figure as yet. I don't know what that number is likely to be and what it is currently, but I know complaining that monies are outstanding to them.
Okay. Ramesh and Dhanraj, I have another question that just came into me here. If the government, upon coming into office in 2015, would have said there was so much black economy or whatever it was called, so much illegal money that was keeping up the economy, that's on one side. And two, if GAISUCU has been such a drain on the economy, having closed GAISUCU for the past 2 to 3 years in a maximum way, where is that saving then? Shouldn't that saving have been realized as some surplus by the government?
So let me address one point of that question and the issue with GAISUCU. Colleagues, if you go back, I think sometime in 2016 in Starbuck News, I wrote an article then when I warned about this ambition of closing GAISUCU and this nonsensical argument. I think the biggest problem with this argument that the government had at the time was that they missed a fundamental principle that is called scale economics. Look, GAISUCU certainly has serious problems. That sick child that really needs I don't know what kind of doctor to fix. But one of the fact of the matter was that the exports of that particular company was generating serious foreign currency for us, which helps to pop up our foreign currency reserve and also help to keep our exchange rate stable. When you close GAISUCU and you got half of the company down, basically, you might think that you're saving some money here, but all you're doing is shifting the problem that you have from one area to the economy to the next. And that, in my view, is what happened, why the gold reserves were depleted, because of the poor performance now of our export sectors and the less amount of export foreign currency that we're getting, you had to liquidate some of the assets that you have to help keep the exchange rate stable. And again, I'm saying that's my interpretation of it. I'll have to have all the evidence before I can make a conclusive argument. So I think the whole approach with Gaisuku was a colossal failure, notwithstanding the fact that yes, there are genuine problems that Gaisuku faced that needed attention.
Okay. So, Ramesh, I want to just put this back because you have been on the ground and you would have seen and you may be able to tell us a little bit about this aspect. So, Gaisuku, let's just spend a couple of minutes on Gaisuku. Gaisuku has been, a lot of people feel Gaisuku has been a drain on the economy, but there is a perspective that while Gaisuku was a cost to the economy, in that cost was the drainage and irrigation maintenance for most of the coastlands, was also housing, potable water service, and a whole host of services for various communities. Now that Gaisuku has been compressed and closed in a large manner, all of those costs are now direct costs to the government without the compensating revenues coming in, right? Your thought.
Correct. I think the drainage and irrigation, I mean, I don't have the exact number, but that's in the tune of billions. And it could be $1-2 billion that Gaisuku might have been spending behind. The healthcare is probably half a billion. You know, so the figures are there somewhere, but the subsidies that were given to Gaisuku in the tune of $5 billion and $4.5 billion or so was covering the drainage and irrigation, was covering healthcare. Do you know Gaisuku used to also contribute $1 billion per year to NIS? That no longer is there, almost. Good. So when you were covering current pension costs and so forth, some of that was coming from Gaisuku. Gaisuku had troubles indeed, had challenges. Gaisuku needed to be restructured to reach to that standard. But I guess in the next few days, you will see what the reports are on Gaisuku and what took place there. I was a director on Gaisuku's board up to last December.
So we have to hold you responsible.
No, you can't hold me responsible because I state clearly in my resignation letter why I removed myself. Again, I don't want to discuss that in detail right now, but they would have had a lot of trouble before. There was no right sizing of Gaisuku. There was a wrong sizing of Gaisuku, right? I just give you one example. Gaisuku's assets for 4 estates were removed from its balance sheet at zero realizable value. And none of its entity moved into the special purpose entity. So what you had is a company with smaller assets and larger liabilities, resulting in it being insolvent. Good? That will take another hour or two for us to discuss all of those elements.
Correct. But Ramesh, yeah, go on.
Let me add something quickly to what Ramesh said. You see, this is where economists and people in finance, we have two different measures sometimes when we look at things. And not that anyone is better over the other, but situations require them to be used. What the government was calling about the deficit that is subsidy that Gaisuku required, that was purely in financial terms. Economists use the term whether there is an economic loss or economic profit that an entity generates. And that is where they had not factored in all the other things that Gaisuku had been supporting: community health care, drainage and irrigation, and all kinds of the payments that Gaisuku was making to the salaries that were going to all the Gaisuku workers. This comes right back to
plus employment.
Exactly. And then remember again, Ramesh talked about this earlier. Where does the government get taxes from? Every time you spend money, you generate an economic activity. Every time you interact, you generate an economic activity with when you're spending money. And through that process, value is created and you get taxes from it. So when you cut off a huge portion of the cake and send so many people home, who are generating this activity and where is the value coming from? So that is also part of why the entire economy, the overall economic activity in the economy started to slow. So to make decisions purely on the income statement to say, okay, you're running short $5 billion here a year, it was not the most accurate thing to do. It was not a sensible approach.
So the situation there is economic value added, right? If I can explain that let me see if I can explain that as low as practical. So the subsidy is going to Gaisuku was a substantial amount of about $6 billion or so, I believe it was, per annum. Let's take away $3 billion of that to drainage and irrigation and other welfare services and so forth. Technically, they were getting about a $3 billion subsidy, all right? Now, that $3 billion, let's call it $4 billion if you want, would have gone to employees, good? Now, there's another concept that Dhanraj, I'm sure, can explain in much greater detail than I could, is the velocity of money and determining the coefficient in which money will turn over. Basically, you give $1 to one employee, go to the shop, you spend, that shop goes somewhere else and spend, and so forth. Good? So that $4 billion that you just give there could be as much as $10 billion of revenue for the country, all right, in other realms. So if the government had to take that $4 billion and go and give it individually out, they would have a lesser impact on it then. Good? But that economic turn or churn that you call it, all right, is what was dragged out of the economy, all right? The GDP and the consumption, we're spending far less money per annum and in private consumption per year, $25–30 billion, as compared to what we were spending 5 years ago. All right? Okay. In terms of local consumption, I have the figures in front of me, but we are certainly spending less money in private consumption, which is household consumption and everything else. Good? Okay.
So, I have to mention this before.
When one puts subsidies in businesses, it tends to give you greater value down the line. Now, if you wanted to correct the situation at Gaisuku, you should have had a proper plan and social safety nets for people to fall back on, an alternative job before you make that harsh decision.
Let me make this point very quickly before we move off the topic. And you see this whole idea about Gaisuku being a drain on the national budget and state of finance. Again, I find it very hard to wrap my mind around this, even if I get away from the economic side of things. Consider this, that in 2015, the office of the president or ministry of the president, whichever name you want to call it, was being funded at the level of about $3.4 billion a year.
Say that again.
The office of the president or ministry of presidency, whichever you want to call it, it was funded in 2015 at the level of about $3.4 billion a year.
And that's with a B, billion, right?
Billion, B. So let's call it $4 billion. In 2019 budget, you know how much money was allocated to that Ministry of Presidency? $12 billion. So from 4 to 12, you added $8 billion more to our government bureaucracy, but you can't find 5 to 6 to 7 or even $8 billion to keep an industry that has thousands of people and a massive multiplier effect on your payroll. That makes no sense to me.
Dhanraj.
So again, even if we move away from the economic and the value added in the process and come strictly back to the numbers, it makes no sense.
Dhanraj, can I ask if that money was shifted from any other part of the government infrastructure, or was it added in total?
That is a hard question to determine, especially when overall the budget for every single one of these sectors of the economy or the ministries, the public agencies would have increased. But what I know, when you look at, so if you go to the national accounts, there is a group of entities that fall under what is called economic opportunity sector. That is like the Ministry of Business, Ministry of Agriculture, Tourism, and Ministry of Natural Resource. When you group them together and combine them, and look at the total funding from 15 to 19, it actually declined.
Oh.
So how do you as a government spend so much money, dig a hole in the budget, but abdicate your responsibility to fund the one thing that should be driving the economy, which is the private sector and the economic opportunities? So the evidence is there. You know, there's a report on the Institute website where we document that. Okay. So consider all of that into perspective, and what you're seeing is a colossal failure here.
Roy?
Yeah, well, what I wanted to do, I guess sometime we'll have to transition to this, but I wanted to introduce the whole concept of how it is that oil can help us. Currently, we have about almost 90 million US.
90 million, yes.
In the NRF. Of course, only in proportion to that, subject to the fiscal responsibility rule. can be pushed into the economy in any given year. Originally, I think the projections for the first year would have been 300 million US. Do you see us achieving that 300 million US at current rate? And how much can be used from the NRF when we get access to it, by the way, to stabilize or stimulate the economy?
I think oil revenues that is currently there will be of much use to us, because the concept of it, I mean, there are lots of things that have to be agreed upon in terms of how that is to be spent and so forth.
Yeah.
And the idea is that you want to keep that invested, earn the returns of that, and then spend the returns and not actually spend that.
Yeah.
There are some people who are of the view that we should go dip right into that and start spending.
There's a budgetary support component of it.
The kind of economic troubles that we are in right now, that $97 million could be done in 4 months.
But we can't access all of it. I mean, even by current standards, we could only access, my average is probably about 12 to 20% of it in budgetary support. Some has to be stabilization, some has to go to investment, and the lesser part goes to budgetary support.
Ruel, to you and the panel, but at the end of the day, regardless of what funding may be available now and in the future, government's policy and the way they enforce and live those policies means a lot to the people in this country and means a lot to what will happen to us. And if we are seeing governments being totally irresponsible, one has to now be worried about these future oil monies, because here is where, on one hand, you can't even have a decent local content policy that can benefit the people of this country. God forbid, if this oil money becomes available under current scenarios, what will happen to it? Because, Ramesh, while you said there are policies for the national fund, the sovereign wealth fund, at the end of the day, we know the way Guyana's laws are structured. The Minister of Finance has almost God almighty powers, and you cannot take this government to court. The president quickly pardons them.
Well, it's not just policy, it's legislation, right? That exists. I mean, there are different views on the legislation, but the legislation, I would say, is not 100% bad. It is because of that legislation nobody can put their hand on the money right now. I would like to tell you that, because the laws and so forth prevent that. And in addition to what's happening with the country and the legitimacy and so forth, right? So whilst it is not perfect, all right, at least there are some laws in place about it. And the next administration, whoever takes that up, will have to review those laws, you know, to either strengthen it, I would hope strengthen, and improve on where we are. But I would say in sum total, it's not 100% zero. All right.
Back to sugar, Ramesh. Ramesh, I want to ask you this question. Back to sugar. There's thousands, I think 7,000 employees who would have lost a job in the last 5 years. I want to ask, how heartened should they be of any time soon of the sugar industry being able to go back to where it was maybe pre-2015, based on what we've seen of the economy right now? Should they be heartened?
I really can't answer that question. There are too much unknowns there. We've seen the request for funding. We don't know what is the state of the industry currently. Rebuilding things that have been left down is very difficult. The next administration will have to seriously contemplate where things are. If things get resolved in a week or two, you might have to be able to salvage certain things. If it prolongs longer than that, things will be dire. I wish I knew heading, but I don't have enough information to answer that question at this point in time.
And quickly, I would have interviewed a couple of administrators, that's former ministers within the coalition, and one of the things that they would have said or claimed is that the Petrocarib arrangement, the Marriott Hotel, the sugar industry, and a couple of other things, including some judgment from the courts. I think TCL, Trinidad Cement was one of them, and maybe I think the BK judgment as well. What kind of impact would this have had on the sliding of the economy to where we're seeing it right now?
Well, the government in the last 5 years collected an additional $350 billion compared to the previous 5 years. Those judgments, I think, don't exceed $2 billion. Right? So it's unable for that alone to cause the economy to slide. Don't see how $2 billion in the context of $350 billion extra, all right, could be used as an excuse to say that the economy is sliding.
So, gentlemen, thank you for those stark numbers. Dhanraj, I want to ask you to comment. What's your view as an economist on the roles of the policymakers and, of course, those in authority? What's your economic review of their performance, sir? I know this is objective or subjective, depending on how you want to look at it, maybe subjective. But what is your view as an economist of the performance of those who have the reins of the economy in their hands?
So I will try to parse that question in just two parts and talk quickly about the policy itself and then about the administration of it, because you can have the best of policy, you see, but when you implement, you have to implement and administrate that policy, and that too hinges on its success. Now, when you look at the overall policy approach that the last administration took, they took office and a lot of it was just spend. And this is part of a short-sighted way in which I believe sometime in Guyana we look at things that we believe the more you spend on something means the better it will get. But that does not necessarily that is not necessarily the conclusion. You can be spending a lot of money on stuff and you're not getting anywhere. It's all comes down to what you're using the money for. How are you getting a good return for it? Are you improving the quality of service? Are you expanding services? Are you making putting a more efficient system in place so that you can reap more for every dollar that you spend? When you look at those kinds of measures, we did a report about 2 years ago when we had to caption this report that taxpayers are paying more for less in return. And so, while I have serious concern with some of the policies that the administration had, overall the expansionary approach was not bad, but then the question was, what did you get for it? I mean, if you go back and just look at some of the sectors, let's say, for example, public safety, you have in 15, public safety was funded about $20 billion a year. In 2019, the budgetary allocation was $43 billion. That's more than double. But yet, if you qualify a truck now or a police car now in a village because you're getting robbed, the vehicle reached there 2 hours after. You see? Okay. So where is the quality coming from? What are we getting for the money? And that is where I think when you look hard and fast, no matter how you look, you're not seeing evidence of a return of the money.
And so the other thing that I want, while this is not finance related, Ramesh, but I still want your thoughts on it if you don't mind. Now, there is a serious concern, and I know that you would have been part of a number of discussions, stakeholder discussion on on oil policy and things like that. There is this serious concern, as Annette Arjun would have been sharing with us, that over 10 billion cubic feet of gas would have been flared. Guyana has now moved to the top tier of countries in the world that are probably most dangerous, but with the most flaring going on. We know that there is an option of flaring or venting, but of course there is an option of tapping and getting that as a revenue stream. Ramesh, what's your thoughts and what would you say should that be among the priorities of an incoming government?
Meaning landing natural gas on shore?
Yes.
I think so. I mean, one of the challenges that we have is very high energy costs, all right? Right now, that natural gas in whatever form it is would either be injected back to bring out more of the oil or flared, and I think the company would have explained why they're doing because of some dysfunction of some equipment or something like that. But rather have that wasted, and if it can be landed on shore, it will severely have an impact on reducing the energy and power costs, which will have very positive impact on manufacturing and other things that we are disadvantaged currently. So I would like to see some focus on that. Of course, we have to balance that with our overall environmental strategies and policy in terms of what we want to deal with our low carbon green economy or whatever terminology is going to be adopted, and try to balance that. But it seems to be a quicker fix than the hydro at this point in time. And I think a lot of people are looking at how they can commercialize the gas. So I think a priority should be paid about that. I'm not claiming that I know everything technical about that. What I can tell you is that if it contributes to lower power and electricity costs, it surely will have a positive impact on everything else that we do in the country from a manufacturing and production perspective.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, I must say thanks to you all for joining us in room 592 tonight. I'm going to come back to you for a couple seconds of wrap up on your thoughts as we say goodbye tonight. But let me say this to our viewers and listeners out there. It has been a good chat tonight, looking at the state of the Guyana's economy, whether we are, if we're not careful, whether we are in danger of entering into that state of bankruptcy, whether we are bankrupt already, or whether there is some kind of insolvency. We do know that Gaisuku has even more serious problems now because they have declared they don't have monies, and the Ministry of Finance says, well, they can't help them. So we have problems going on. We also know, viewers and listeners, there is a serious health emergency in this country with coronavirus disease, COVID-19. And I say this over and over, and this is not a burden upon my two guests here. This is my personal view, that one of the biggest disappointments has been that the incumbent government has selected a bunch of politicians to head a national health crisis task force. And that alone speaks volume. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been good to have this discussion on the economy. Ramesh, Dhanraj, I'm going to come to you for your closing thoughts, but let me say this to viewers and listeners. Tomorrow night in room 592, we're going to have a discussion 2020 and beyond with Dr. Irfan Ali, President-elect Irfan Ali. Dhanraj, your closing thoughts, please.
So again, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to chat with the panelists and talk to viewers. My closing thoughts here is this. I think, as you rightfully mentioned, that I feel I have such a humble feeling with the state of the economy and the way it is being handed to the new president, the president-elect. And I feel for him because he's handed an economy that is in the worst possible state that it could be, at the same time with a global pandemic that is at the unprecedented level, and at the same time a political crisis that would have consequences in the way investors view Guyana economy. These things have implications. They affect the economy. But I have no doubt that the challenge before the new administration is going to be tough. But I have no doubt that they can surmount it. The economy is not, like I said, bankrupt. I would not use that term. But I think we're in a state of coma, and we need an injection of serious reversal of the way we're approaching economic development in the country if we're going to survive this and get back on a path to long-term prosperity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ramesh, 60 seconds, your closing thoughts, sir.
All right. Thank you for having me. Economies are not things that you can put on autopilot. It requires active, proactive management and policies to be developed on a very regular basis. To get out of where we are right now, we need a functioning National Assembly and Parliament, and we need our legitimate government to be in place. The faster those things can be resolved and sorted, the faster the solutions to the challenges of the economy can be determined.
Thank you very much. And let me say hello again to you all, viewers and listeners, as I ask Mr. Johnson, any final thoughts from you, sir?
Well, just my gratitude for being here, and I'd like to thank the guests for appearing.
Well, I've never heard Roel be so gracious. Leonard, your thoughts, sir?
I'm going to be gracious too. It's always good to hear from the experts, and of course, Mr. Dhanraj and Ramesh has been very, very knowledgeable about whatever they're saying. I'm learning a lot in this entire thing. $92 billion in the red. Not good things to look at, but we are going to continue to have these discussions.
Thank you. And certainly we want to talk about tourism, we want to talk about sugar, we want to talk about gold, but these elections have to be put behind us, and we need to see a legitimate government in place. So when we get to that stage, we're going to expand our discussion. But ladies and gentlemen, it's been good to have you here in room 592. Please join Mr. Gildari and yours truly tomorrow as we continue our elections watch and COVID watch on Kaicho Radio at 1:30. know that you can call in on that program. But tomorrow night, let's return to room 592 as we have a discussion on 2020 and beyond with President-elect Dr. Irfan Ali. Good night to you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Say a prayer for this lovely country of ours. Bye-bye now.